So, hello, Mrs. Brackney. Good to see Mrs. Brackney here tonight. She's come all the way from Michigan to watch Tim Mackey. So I mentioned it earlier. I wanted to, because tonight's lesson, we talked about it earlier, the fact that it's kind of a heady lesson. It's a lot about imagery and reality, things like that. And I think it really helps to kind of go back and look at what we talked about last week, because what he does is he asks their opinion on the things that he talked about last week. So it would help to remember kind of what he was talking about. So he talked about how biblical authors tell the truth, and talked about historical reflection, and the historicity of the first 3 chapters of Genesis, or if you talk about the Hebrew Bible, the Tanakh, and the care that we need to take in how we take what we've learned in the context and setting that we've learned it in, about these divine origins, and being certain and sure not to give them a new meaning. In other words, giving new meaning to something that did not mean what we're trying to make it mean. We have been really fortunate here at Arlington because there's been such an emphasis on context and the background of the situation for the text that's been written. So in other words, why it was written, who it was written to, who are these people, why do they need to hear? You hear a lot of that here, and that's why. It's so that we don't take something out of context and make it mean something completely different. And so he spent a little time talking about when you look at historical reflection and what we have learned, how do we keep from doing that? Because he says these chapters, he quoted, or it was a quote, it said, these chapters are dialed into the word and syllable in order to introduce the very specific themes of the Tanakh. So if you remember, we were deep in a lot of these passages with the language and the meaning of some of those words, and they all contribute to what it meant and who it was for, and that historical reflection is something that we want to hold sacred, or hold very important. So he talked about a couple of questions. He said, are these texts in the end the result of careful design, literary design, wordplay, symbolism? Is it creative language trying to spark our imagination? And of course, when he asked the question, everybody was shaking their heads. Yes, because you can tell, and especially when it's pointed out to you, you can see that the author is taking you somewhere. The author's leading you to understand something that is divine. And that's not an easy thing to do when you're being led to understand something divine. So the authors have been very intentional. That's the word I was looking for. So he used an extended quote from John Walton. And it basically, I'm not going to read the quote, but it's sort of centered around 2 things. What do you call this kind of literature when you're reading the Bible and you're reading, especially here in Genesis, and as we've talked about, all the symbolism and the places that it's taking to you? What do you call it? What kind of literature do you refer to it as? And then he says, in light of how we label this type of literature, how do we begin to talk about historical reference of what really happened? And so he goes into this discussion about how the ancients thought versus how we think. They're very different. And it was really interesting as he pointed those things out. For instance, the ancients, he said they just think differently than we do. They perceive the world differently than we do, with different categories and priorities than we do. Our culture, we think scientifically. We're concerned with cause and effect, composition, systemization. The ancient world thinks in terms of symbols and express things through imagery. We're interested in facts, events. They're more interested in ideas and representation. So that's why you see, and the more you think about it, there's so much imagery in Scripture. From the garden all the way, you start with the garden and you go from there, and it's just imagery after imagery, and it's there for a reason. And so the ancient world just thought differently. And then just talking about representing history. So John Walton sort of invented a term where he called it imagistic. Do you remember that word? Because it was a sort of a combining of imagery and I forget what the other word was. But it was sort of a combining of several things together to come up with this word. He called it imagistic thinking versus or in contrast to scientific or analytical thinking. And he used the two illustrations, if you'll remember, of the night sky. And one was a picture from the Hubble Space Telescope that was taken in the early 2000s. And if you remember, it's a picture, if you remember, it's just a dark picture, but all those bright lights, and all those bright lights that we would assume are stars were actually galaxies. Over 2,000 galaxies in that small, tiny little piece of space that had been captured by the Hubble telescope. You had that imagery of the night sky versus, or you had that image of the night sky versus the picture of Van Gogh called Starry Night. And it's a painting, that I had that written down. Showing the millions of galaxies. Yeah, the painting of Van Gogh's Starry Night. And so he said, when you look at those two pictures, he says, which of those is the night sky? And they're both the night sky, but one has been brought about by lots of technology, zooming, pasting, cutting, putting together to form this image. The other has been painted by interpretation, what they think night feels like. And so that's kind of the way he is pointing out the difference between the way the ancients thought versus the way we think. And that's kind of it's a really well laid out way to describe that. So the original authors are trying to communicate something very real and meaningful in the way Scripture is written. And we have to have more ability, more tools to understand it than just our scientific cause and effect, what are the facts approach. Does that make sense? We can't come at Scripture like we come at the rest of the world and the things we read. They're written differently. And so that's one of the things that I really appreciate about Mark and Tommy both is they try to get to that point to say, let me tell you about these people that are being written to. Let me tell you about the situation that was going on here. Because all of those things make your text more rich and more clear. Were you going to say something, Mark?
Prophets. Talk about imagination off the charts.
Oh, yeah.
Like the way they wrote, the language they used, the pictures they painted, the visions that they had. The closest we have to that is Revelation. Some of the imaginative thinking that's
Which is, yeah, like you say, off the chart. It's just off the charts.
And if you try to read it from a scientific, analytic, factual, check the box, that's why you have all these books that are written on Revelation. Trying to say, well, this is that, and this is this, and this is, and they've all been wrong.
Yeah.
This is being fulfilled now here. This is, yes and no. It is written. It is timeless. And our principle, you can't read it scientifically.
Exactly.
Well, I want to add one thing, is the prophets were being prophesying a certain event or activity, and that was done purposely in advance, because later it's going to be revealed that these things did happen, and they actually track down what actually happened that was professed to happen in past. So the truth is brought into it.
That's right.
So we see it all laid out.
It's kind of like there in Matthew, what is it, Matthew 24, that you have the three parables about judgment and pending judgment. It's very imaginative, descriptive. But you can talk about destruction of Jerusalem, but it's just done in a different way.
In a different way, yeah.
Well, if you're receiving prophetic truths that are coming out, and then they say, expect this in the sometime distant future, your odds of believing that's going to happen is just increased because of the evidence you see of those truths they already predicted.
Right.
They're not Nostradamus.
So, let's see. So he says, there's something that the biblical authors believe is real and truthful here, but the way they represent truth is different from how we conceive of historical truth. It's hard for us not to kill the butterfly as we seek to analyze it. That was the illustration he used. And so Mackey wants to get the students' view of these things that they've just talked about, the things that I've just reviewed. So two things: what thoughts, questions, reflections come to mind when you consider Walton's perspective on imagistic thinking and the many ways we represent reality. Then the second thing that they will talk about, in whatever way we seek to represent reality, we're always bringing something greater, transcendent narrative to the, I cannot read my writing. In whatever way we seek to represent reality, we are always bringing some greater transcendent narrative to bear to describe what happened. So we'll watch from here. Hopefully that helps us kind of grasp a little bit more and just remember a little bit more from last week, so that tonight's items will mean a little bit more. Also, pay attention towards the end. Pay attention to a couple. They all the students at times make really insightful comments. But in particular, listen towards the end of the segment where the gentleman on the far right, on the right, I don't know how else to describe him. He has the beard and the longer hair. We don't have their names. And then he has a really interesting view and insight. And then the gentleman with the cap, he also has something really interesting to say. So pay attention to those, and we'll talk a little bit more when that's done.